Thanks so much for joining us today, Rebecca.
Thank you for having me, Lynn Marie.
I always love to have you on. I say always, like you've been on 50 times. This is the second time we've had you on, but it's always a delight. Rebecca and I are, I think now, dear friends since our first recording. You're one of my favorite
I
people.
think so too. I agree.
All right. Yeah. How awkward if you've been like, you're all right.
No, you're one of my people who I've met during this pandemic. I've never met you in person, but we have such a lovely connection and have so much to talk about. So I'm excited to chat with you today. It's a treat.
Excellent. Yay. I love that. I love that. Now, we are here to talk about psychedelics and parenting. And if anybody knows me in person, I have zero offspring. So this is going to be very informative for parents. For me, I am going to try my best to like put myself in a parental mindset. And I'm very interested to hear, first off, how you got into the concept of psychedelics and parenting.
The first thing is that I'm a parent. I have two boys. One is 4 and one is 6, almost 7. And as I got further into the work of psychedelics as a harm reduction therapist, psychedelic preparation and integration therapist, I started understanding that there wasn't a lot of spaces for parents specifically to be talking about the work that they're doing. And I also understood that when I would tell people, select people, what I did, it was like the floodgates opened. It was like people really wanted to talk about this with me. And I was a person that they could share things with that they couldn't share with a lot of other people in their world. So I understood that it was important that this particular topic be covered. Now, Planned Parenthood is not the first group to cover this topic, but right now we're the I think we're the only group that talks about psychedelics and parenting specifically. So, I understood that there was a need. And then so what I did is I partnered with the Brooklyn Psychedelic Society, and we threw our first event, which was a panel discussion about this topic. So we had a mom who used psychedelics, a dad who used psychedelics. We had a lactation consultant, and she was talking about this idea of mother to child transmission through breastfeeding. And we had a medicine worker as well talking about it. So once I did that, then I really understood that this topic had legs and needed to become its own separate thing, and that there needed to be a forum to discuss all of the elements of psychedelics and parenting, from integration to talking to your children about it, to talking to your parents about it, to children taking psychedelics, which is perhaps the most, you know, like mind-blowing thing, but is actually happening. Um, and looking at it from a few different angles. So looking at it from a Western scientific angle, looking at it from a historical and cultural angle, and looking at it from a community angle of really connecting people who are in this space or who are interested in being in this space.
Yeah, just in that intro, you brought up so many things I had not thought about, like the lactation issue right off the bat. Like, oh, transmitting through breastfeeding, that's a whole nother topic by the way, do you remember was there I guess every psychedelic's probably different in how it's transmitted. That sounds like a whole nother episode we're just going to have on its own.
Yeah, well, I mean, the reality is that there's not very much information about it. Just as there's not a ton of information specifically about women's health and, in general, right? But to do a study with breastfeeding mothers who are actively using either cannabis or psychedelics, cannabis is a psychedelic, that there's some some quandaries with doing a study like that, right? So we have lots of anecdotal evidence. We have lots of cultural and anthropological evidence about what happens in families who use psychedelics throughout the life cycle. But we don't have, like a Western scientific medical studies on that so much. We have some, information is conflicting and it's a little hard to come by, but um, yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, it is really interesting. And people ask about that a lot.
I imagine. And you just brought up something about other cultures and then the paradigms from those cultures. Can you talk a little bit about what you know about how, those cultures that have been working with psychedelics for millennia and that have had families, what you know about that and how that translates to the work you do today?
Yes. So we know of many cultures who use plant medicines, I should say, plant sacraments, really, throughout the life cycle, uh, from pregnant mothers, breastfeeding mothers, children, adolescents, as rites of passage, often as rites of passage into adulthood, from the Huichol Indians to the Buiti tribes who use iboga, to to the Santo Daime Church, and other Brazilian indigenous traditions who use ayahuasca. And what we know about the it's a little bit hard to paint a broad brushstroke, but essentially what we know is that there is a cultural framework for using plant medicines that allows for this work to not be stigmatized. There's a community framework. It's something that children are familiar with. It's something that parents are giving their children because in their mind, this is a healthy, important, spiritual tool, and it's used in ceremonial contexts. It's not used really ever in recreational contexts. So when you have a framework like that, first of all, there's no stigma attached to it. So you can talk about it openly in your community with your peers. Secondly, it's not uh, it's not being used in what Dr. Julie Holland calls this adrenalized way. So there's no extra shame and secrecy about it, and therefore it's being used in a dose appropriate way, and not kind of squirreled away like in the woods with your friends. Like that's not how it's being used. So, as we think about this period that we're in, which is greater access, greater uh, greater therapeutic access, and also recreational access, it's something that it needs to be on our minds. How do we approach this topic without stigmatizing it so that when our children inevitably find out about it, we can have an open dialogue. We can have a space to, to discuss this, to help them prepare for what they may encounter if they decide that that's appropriate for them. And we can help kids who will receive these treatments, who are already receiving these treatments as part of a medical protocol.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, some people might, like you said, the giving of psychedelics to kids may be the most, let's say, controversial part of what we're discussing. But I remember at the Psychedelic Science Conference speaking with Rick Doblin, and he was saying that phase 4 requires them to be testing MDMA for PTSD on teenagers, essentially. So this is not something that is like, oh, I can't believe that this is being discussed. This is actually something the FDA is actively, requiring that they look into. So this is coming, because if this is working for adults, say just MDMA as an example, well, there are plenty of teens that have trauma. So let's help them with that same way. And like you said, when the stigma is taken out, or the adrenalized version is taken out, and you're left just with what the medicine can do in its most sacred space, then it's much more likely that we're going to get the benefit without a lot of the potential drawbacks.
That's right. And yes, I had the same conversation with Rick Doblin as well. It's up on our social media channels. And it's not just happening in the future, it's happening right now. Teens are receiving ketamine as a treatment for depression. And, we might kind of balk at that, right? Our eyes might widen like, oh my God, I can't believe that. We're giving kids psychedelics already. But let's think about that for a second. Ketamine is used as a treatment for treatment-resistant depression. That means that some of these kids may have been down other roads and have failed, at getting better. And not only that, but if you think about a teen who is suicidal, like what are your options, right? Give them something that doesn't work and may increase their risk of of suicidality, which is what happens with certain SSRIs in teens. Or you give them a psychedelic, right? That works. I mean, that seems like an easy choice to me. Of course, you want to save your kids. This is really a matter of life-saving work. But not just that, we also know that from the work in the ER that's with ketamine, that children and teens do better with that transition between the psychedelic state and the ordinary state of consciousness, because kids are already in some kind of like psychedelic state often, right? Like their brains are already like wonderfully wacky, right? So coming back from that can be really jarring for grown-ups in a way that it's not for kids. And just one other point here is like, think about the drugs that we give kids now to treat something like ADHD. We give them stimulants, right? Like, and nobody really bats an eyelash, right? Like that's, you take it in the school, like it's not, nobody's thinking that you're a terrible parent for giving that to your children. So when you compare this to, kids taking a psychedelic, it's like, well, maybe it's not all that alarming.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Many, many very good points. And thank you for bringing that up. The ketamine is actually being administered right now. This is not in the future. That's so many times we have to remember, like, ketamine is out there. Let's look at what's actually happening right now. And like you said, the lives that it can be saving in that very vulnerable population. I'd love to ask, as a parent who uses psychedelics, we'll assume, how has psychedelics helped you in parenting, become a better parent, or how has it informed your parenting, or maybe your relationship to your own parents, which of course is, I'm sure, something that many parents would like to look at as a model for what goes on, as they raise their children. So if you could talk a little bit about that, please.
So I'm going to talk in broad brushstrokes here and maybe a little bit of personal stuff. I'll talk broadly. A lot of the work of psychedelics is the work of reparenting yourself. It's the work of healing intergenerational trauma. So when we do that work on ourselves and we do the work of integration, our children are present, they're watching, they're listening, they're absorbing. If I am in the process of learning to be kinder to myself, that's going to trickle down. It's also going to trickle down in terms of how we respond to our children's behavior. So, I think for many parents, one of the driving factors for them to take psychedelics in the first place is because they're noticing how they respond to their children and they don't like it. I think one of the very special elements of parenting is like opening your mouth and reacting spur of the moment. And all of a sudden you're like, who was that? It's like, oh my God, that was my mom. That was my dad. Right. And it can be, it depends, right? How how much we like that response. But for some of us, it's something that we kind of understand, like that's something that needs to change. I don't want to repeat whatever that was. And so we end up, working with non-ordinary states of consciousness to address that. And then our integration process kind of helps us create a new pattern in our parenting that disrupts these generational patterns of trauma.
That makes sense. Real quickly,
Yeah.
is there somebody like above you that's stomping around a lot or something? Do you hear a lot of?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, maybe let's try the ear pods.
Yeah.
I'll just put a thing at the beginning that says, "Oh, and she sounds different midway through." That's what happened.
Very cavernous.
Yes. Is this your apartment? Or
Hold on.
sure.
How's that?
That's good.
Okay. I'm downstairs. I'm like in the storefront. I'll tell you later.
I can still hear them.
Okay.
I was hoping
right now you can hear them?
Yeah. So I'm wondering if it's not picking up your headphones.
I don't hear it. I hear that.
Oh yeah, I can hear all that.
Oh, you can hear that. Oh. So I can move upstairs. Do you want me to do that?
Do you think, can you tap on, like, are you sure that, can you look at the Skype settings to see that it's picking up your earphones?
It definitely is. Yeah, because I can
Oh.
hear you in my earphones.
But, and the microphone too?
Hold on one second.
Okay.
Oh, that's totally different. Much better.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that there was a difference there.
Yeah.
I just learned something new.
Yay! Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Carrying on.
There we go. Fantastic.
You also asked about what changes in your relationship with your own parents. And this is actually a topic that has come up a few times. What has happened is that people have come to our event who were not parents, but of course they're children of parents, right? Everybody's a child of a parent. And the question that has been asked a few times is, how do you talk about this with your own parents? So this also invites a really interesting dialogue about, first of all, boundaries, and second of all, your own kind of feeling of safety in having that discussion. So we will be talking a lot more about that because we think when I say we, I mean myself and my colleague Andrew Rose, who also works on this project. And we're going to be talking a lot more about that topic because I think something that happens a lot in the psychedelic space is that people experience success, or they feel much better, and they feel very eager to share the work that they've done, and perhaps to involve others in their family in that healing. Now, in certain families, that's a great idea, and in other families, that might not be such a great idea. I just had a really fascinating conversation with Dr. Monica Williams and her daughter, Zoe, who is, they're both amazing. It was a fascinating conversation. But one of the things that they came up was that they had done some work together. And they mentioned, it was actually Zoe who mentioned that part of the experience was very difficult for her. It was hard for her to watch her mom go through such difficult emotions. And this led me to thinking about what kinds of conversations are very specific to the preparation period. If you're going to do a psychedelic experience with a child or parent, questions like, how's it going to be for you to see me in a place like that where you might not be able to help me? How can we take a little bit of space from each other if what we're going through is too intense and we need to step back and be in our own experience? Is there anything that we need to talk about and air out before we go into an altered state together? Things like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I've always thought, yeah, I'm not sure personally my family is the one to do it, but that was one of my biggest things. Even if they were, I don't know that I would want to like hand them off to a very experienced facilitator, but not necessarily be there for it. Because I think
Yep.
it's one thing also for me to see that, but then also for them to I imagine it would be slightly harder to be fully vulnerable and completely let go with their child in the room. So I really applaud those who go for that joined effort. But you're right, that's a whole second consideration when you're going into that, is like, well, let's prepare for that, the possibilities of that experience in itself being slightly different, challenging at the time.
Mhm.
For sure. Thanks for bringing
Yeah,
that up.
it just depends on your family, right? Like your family might work for and another family it might not. So it's very individual.
Yeah, I can imagine. Now, on the flip side, so we know that psychedelics can help you, like you said, reparent yourself and start to heal some intergenerational trauma, which would help with parenting. What are some of the things that make it more difficult as a parent to do psychedelic journeys?
So this is a really fascinating phenomena of this moment in particular during the pandemic. From my perception, there's this divide that was, obviously there's a difference between being a parent and not being a parent. During the pandemic, the gap gets a lot bigger because the issues that parents and non-parents are dealing with are so different from each other. So whereas a person without children or without who's living by themselves, they're experiencing loneliness and isolation. That's the main thing that is troublesome about this moment. Versus parents, at least parents of young children, they are experiencing this unbelievable level of chaos, having zero time to themselves, which already is sort of a challenge in a non-pandemic time. And so, in some ways, I think there can be almost like maybe a little resentment, from each kind of group to another, and this gap kind of widens. The issue of privacy and time is a particular challenge for parents in this moment. So how are you so for some parents, like, it's not a problem for their children to be around during their psychedelic experience itself. And for some parents, they feel like, you know what, I want this time for myself. This is my time to go inward, to journey into my psyche. And I don't want to be a parent during that moment. I don't want to have to worry about what my kid needs at that time. So time, space, and then of course there is an integration period. And we're really interested in this topic of integration alone and integration together. So something like journaling, for example, that's something like I want to be alone with my thoughts to write in my journal. I don't want to share that experience with my child. It doesn't work, and it kind of creates this maybe frustration of I'm trying to do something and you're there, versus something like let's use yoga as an example. So you know it's different doing yoga by yourself versus doing yoga with your kids. And both of my kids have joined me in doing my yoga practice, which is a huge, important part of my personal integration practice. With my older son, he was, doing it right alongside me and just kind of like joining me in the poses that he could, and it was very sweet. My younger son was sort of like burrowing underneath me as I did my downward dogs. It was a playful moment between us that feels nice and for both parties. Another thing that we talk about is the element of ceremony that does not necessarily have anything to do with medicine, but it may or may not, right? But ceremony itself, ceremony is ritual, ceremony is connection to nature, ceremony is connection to our ancestors, and all of these things are beautiful things to include your children in. So this is something that my family has done a couple times, and I think we'll do more of, is creating our own ceremony where we laid out objects from nature, objects that had personal resonance. We asked for participation. Everybody gets to do their own part of the ceremony, whether it's choosing the food or choosing the music. There's a sensory quality, so we light something that smells good, we eat something that tastes good, and then we sang songs, we've been outside on the beach or on the big lawn, and it's been a beautiful practice that I think was actually very healing, and much like a medicine ceremony, just there was no substance at ours in particular.
Wow, that's a really interesting concept. And it makes me think of even something that's maybe kind of in between, where something like breath work that maybe everybody can take part in, setting up ceremonies around that. Or like you said, even with just bringing the ceremonial aspect in and involving your kids sounds like a great way to bring everybody closer and just expand those relationships. And I'm interested, so in your work with other parents, is there an age at which, well, first off, let's talk about the conversation with your children at some point about psychedelic use. What does that look like in the community? I mean, I realize it probably varies person to person significantly, but overall, what's some of the consensus in your group about having that discussion?
This is a great question. And one of the things that I'm just prefacing my answer by saying that right now, something interesting that's happening is that access and decriminalization efforts are outpacing drug education reform. So what we have is this patchwork, frankly, ridiculous system of educating our children about drugs, which is often, not always, but often fear-based, abstinence-only based, and not factually accurate. And that's what we can expect from our school system. So we definitely need to take this conversation into our own hands. As far as age, I think that we can start talking about plant medicine or substance use or addiction from the very earliest time that our kids can understand. So I'll share what this sounds like in my family. My kids know that I am addicted to coffee. They know that if I don't have it, I have symptoms. They know that both myself and them are addicted to screens, and that it's something that we have to be really careful with, and that we have to consume mindfully and thoughtfully. I mean, whether that happens or not, I mean, especially right now, I don't know about that, but that's what we talk about, right? And my older son is beginning to know a little bit more about other substances as well. So I hear uh, different things about whether this conversation is proactive or reactive. In other words, do I feel comfortable saying to my child, this is what, cannabis is, this is what psilocybin is, etc., or do I wait for them to say to me, what does that smell, or what is that thing that I just found in your closet, right? And so I guess personally I guess I'm a little on the fence about it, and I've definitely had conversations with my older son where I said, did you smell that? Let me tell you what that is. And so the dialogue is coming from me, and I'm able to control the narrative. I say that's a plant, and this is also a really important point. I said this is a plant that people use to feel calmer, but it's not legal. And it's not legal. I don't get into the nuances of it because he's just 6 years old, but I just say it's not legal. But the people who get in trouble for it are people who have black and brown skin. But the people who don't get in trouble with it for it are the people who have white skin. And do you think that that's fair? And so it actually invites this really other important dialogue about the war on drugs and the disproportionate effects on black and brown communities. And it becomes a different, not a different, it becomes a relevant conversation, not necessarily about the substance itself, but about the legality of the substance and the fairness of, or unfairness, I should say, of the rules around these substances. I think that as kids get older, it does become more important to be a bit more proactive, because the reality is that they will be exposed to this, especially as access increases, and access is exploding right now. So then it becomes a conversation about, this is what these substances are, and this is what I think you need to consider before you use them. So different parents have different opinions, right? Some parents say, I want my kids to have their first experience with me. Some parents say, I want to tell my kids, I want you to wait as long as possible. Some parents say, I know you're going to do this, so here's what I want you to consider. But all the parents who I've spoken to, who are leaders in our field, have said, I want them to know from me, and I want them to know about careful preparation. I want them to know about set and setting, and just using this in a safe way, because these are powerful, powerful substances. And while they might be, cause less harms than other substances that are readily available to us, we need to have a very, it's something that can create harm if we use it like teens, use a lot of things, right? Which is sort of willy-nilly and reactive and, in a secretive way.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And something that I wish I could bring up like once per episode, but I think I brought up in 0 episodes so far. We're like 79 in, but the safety aspect is both on a personal level for each child who is thinking of taking them in that way, but also, like you said, access is exploding. This is an entire movement. There's so many people working towards making these, like you said, life-saving medicines. And then I look at something like the Netherlands, where they made psilocybin, except for truffles, illegal based on the death of one person. I believe she was 18. And so the damage that can be done to an entire life-saving field through unsafe practices, I think that needs to be brought up too. It's like, if you choose to use these outside of the responsible, guidelines we're telling you about, this could not only hurt you, but you could hurt the chances of a lot of other people to use these as safe medicines. And so I appreciate that part of the conversation, which is you all proactively bringing up, or the idea of people proactively bringing up, this is the safest way, because I'm from the Midwest. I did not see a psychedelic until I was, let's say, 35. But in like nobody in my high school had any. Middle of nowhere, and people from my town, not that any of them listen, but they'd be like, we're not in the middle of nowhere, but close enough as far as psychedelics were concerned. But like, so it was never like, oh, I'm at a rave with ecstasy or whatever. There was nothing like that. But I bet now, I mean, not only now, back in the day, outside of my little town, like that's their first experience, is like, here's a psychedelic and it's a thing you do to rave all night, or here's a psychedelic and it's a thing you only do when we're at a music festival. And that experience, I mean, notwithstanding the fact that yes, you can have experiences in those circumstances, but generally when you prep that set and setting, like you said, you're going to have such a different journey, and the likelihood is that it's going to be less frightening if if you're in a good safe set and setting than if your journey goes poorly and you're at a 3 a.m. rave situation. And that's something that I think when you bring that up before that opportunity arises for them, hopefully then they get to make that a much more informed decision than otherwise, like, oh, this is just where MDMA is done at this rate. So
Mm-hmm.
I love that concept
Yeah.
of setting them
Mm-hmm.
up for success first.
Yeah. And letting and creating an openness to be able to lean on you if they get into trouble. That feels really important, that kids know, especially teenagers know that, look, maybe it's, I don't want you to do this until you're older, but if you do, I want you to know that you can call me and I'm going to help you. You're not going to get in trouble.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's a really good point. And I think just imagining the types of dialogues that these conversations can foster that lead to other ones. Just the amount of openness. Looking back at generations. My generation, definitely the generation before. These kinds of conversations were not that. Like an abstinence-based conversation doesn't lead to a whole lot more sharing, right? You're told don't do a thing,
That's right.
and drugs
That's
are
right.
bad. And then
Right.
but if when you start to say, hey, you can come to me if things are, then they may get the sense, oh, I can also come to her when I'm feeling a little bit bullied at school, or I'm feeling unsafe, or I'm feeling depressed. Like, I think that just opens that whole floodgate of connection there, that obviously, it's like a side effect of psychedelics, which are also already like a great way to to foster connection.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Yeah.
Now, if you could tell us, Planned Parenthood, your group, what has been the value for your members in having this type of community of parents?
So as the field of psychedelics expands, I think what we're noticing more is that people, as part of their integration process, need community. Is more important than ever now, in particular. And they also need their particular affinity group. So, for example, in the BIPOC community, it's it's important that people of color have their own spaces to discuss things that cannot be discussed in a mixed group. The same thing with parents. Look, it's very valuable to have a community of people who can all resonate with the experience of using psychedelics. But I'm just not going to find the same level of resonance if I say to somebody who is in their early 20s who's used psychedelics, like, I'm just having so much trouble with my kids, or like, I don't have any time to integrate because I'm changing diapers and doing laundry. It's like they might say like, oh, that sucks, right? But there's a level of understanding that having a very specific community, you can drop into that safety, you can drop into having, knowing that the person in front of you is going to get your experience on a level that other people cannot. I think also that there are some really, I don't, what is the word for it? There are some hard conversations coming up in our groups that, when I say hard, what I mean is my sense is that it would be really hard to tell someone who is a parent who doesn't use psychedelics about, to say what is being said in our groups. People are grappling with shame and stigma, and with not with parents are monitored in their communities at a level that is different than other people. I've had many experiences like this, where someone will say to me, I'm walking down the street, someone will say to me, he needs a hat. Or they'll say to me, he's too far away from you. I'm being watched, and I understand that I'm being watched. So there's a level of scrutiny that parents face that is different than what other people face. And it makes people more reticent to be honest and to approach these topics in a way that feels healing and that feels complete, that they're not holding something back.
Wow, that's a really good point. And I can imagine many of the parents out there just really resonated with that. Like that, when somebody confronts you with something that you had not thought of before, like I was like, whoa, that is an incredible thing to just imagine. At all points in time, everybody is judging how I am parenting this small
Hmm.
being that is walking around.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow, that's a
Oh,
very good.
yes. Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. And in a way that there's something valuable about that, I guess. There's something like we do need to be all kind of keeping our eyes on each other in some way. Like that's how we prevent things like child abuse, of course. But then in another way, it's like I won't describe to you what happens in my mind when somebody says your kid is too far away from you, and I actually know my kid, and thank you very much, right? Like those aren't the exact words, but they're a little different than that, right? um, but so it can be helpful, and it can also be inhibiting.
Well, especially with something like psychedelics that has a stigma, has an illegal status that people outside of the community may not understand. And so they may think, oh, I'm reporting this person because I heard them say they're doing psychedelics. They think they're doing the right thing, but it's just like essentially a lack of education that hopefully 10 years down the road we look back and we're like, how would somebody have turned you in for that? But we know that that's the kind of thing that could happen, so I imagine that extra level of scrutiny has to weigh on you at some point.
Absolutely. I think people come to this topic with a lot of preconceived notions that originate in the propaganda from the war on drugs. And so, of course, it seems alarming that a parent who's responsible for a young life would be using these substances. It seems horrifying. But then when you look at what is actually happening for a lot of parents and how they're using them, and how their use has made them as a parent, has improved their parenting so much. I think it's particularly interesting when you look at these things side by side with alcohol, which of course is, the most accessible, easy plant plant medicine on the planet. Um, you know, when you speak to a parent who has come home from who's waking up after a night of heavy drinking, it's like, I don't want to have anything to do with my kids. Like, please don't bother me. I feel awful. And if you do come and talk to me, I'm gonna, send you away. It's just, I can't do this right now. Versus talking to a parent who's just had a psychedelic experience the night before and is basking in that afterglow and is so eager to connect with their child, to be in that space of love with their child, to to integrate those insights in their parenting.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Would you say that I realized we didn't necessarily go into this as much as I would like to, but because it is, so like you said, you kind of paint with broad strokes, but there's the reparenting and there's the dealing with intergenerational trauma. And those are both ways that you kind of heal yourself to go forward as the best parent you can be. Do you hear from a lot of parents that experience just specifics in maybe their children, like perhaps these experiences can open them up to something that maybe had bothered them about their children, but it allows them to reframe and like, oh, now I understand why my child has this behavior, and then that can foster an improvement in their relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing that psychedelics do is it puts people in a state of childlike wonder. You and I were just talking about Robin Carhart Harris, who you're going to be chatting with in a few days or a few weeks, and his research looked at people's brains on LSD and compared them to babies' brains, and he found that they looked really similar. That's what psychedelics do, is it makes us be able to inhabit that open neuroplastic state that children naturally inhabit. So in a sense, it makes us be able to understand them better. It makes us be able to get into their experience in a deeper way. So yes, that was a good point.
Cool. Well, that makes total sense. I had not quite thought of it that way, but yeah, absolutely. To understand them more on their own level and find that helpful moving forward. If you could tell us about what kind of events, I'm sure lots of parents are excited. And first off, at the end, we'll have you tell them where they can find you. But what kind of events does Planned Parenthood have coming up that parents can participate in?
Thanks for asking that. We've got a couple things coming out. So we're super excited that we just launched our Parents Community Integration Circle. It's open to non-parents as well, but I think it will really resonate with parents specifically. Our first meeting is February 24th. It's 8:15 p.m. Eastern time, and it's on our socials. I'll share that in a moment. We're going to have that monthly, and I think that will be a wonderful space for people to be able to come and share about their own particular experiences. So it's lightly facilitated. The other thing that we have, actually we do have one coming up, but we haven't announced it yet, is our webinar, which is about psychedelic integration for parents. And we talk about many of the things that you and I just talked about, and also sort of specifics on how parents and children can integrate together. We'll be doing that again, I think in a few weeks, with the Portland Psychedelic Society. And then in the future, some projects that we're looking forward to doing are conversations around how to have the drug talk with your kids, and also how to disclose to your parents, or not just disclose to your parents, about your psychedelic use. So those are topics that we're intending to cover going forward. And we are on social media, always kind of inviting these challenging and hopefully helpful conversations. So you can find us there. Should I just name that right now? Since I mentioned it, let me just go right into it. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. We are on Instagram as plant_parent, PARNT_hood. That's quite a mouthful. And we're on Facebook as the same. And we just put up a LinkedIn as well. We have our videos up on YouTube where we interview leaders in the psychedelic field about many of the topics that you and I are talking about today. And we also interview parents who are doing this work with psychedelics as well. So we've got a couple interview series on YouTube and all the social channels.
That's really exciting. We will link to all of that in the show notes so
Thank you.
Yeah, so in case they forget the part.
The parent. Planned Parenthood. We are not a huge fan of vowels in our group. Yeah.
That's awesome. Rebecca, I appreciate all of the work you're doing to facilitating these circles and opening this world up to more parents to have this conversation and feel seen and have that community around them. So I appreciate you. And then I appreciate you very much for coming back on today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was so fun chatting with you. I really appreciate that.
Awesome. Well, for everybody else out there, until next time.